How 175 years ago, in an isolated plantation deep in Louisiana's sugar country, military records and local testimonies mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in silence. The Boudreaux brothers disappeared from official records, but not from the oral memory of the community. Their absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that only now begins to be revealed. Before continuing, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The Boudreaux plantation stretched for thousands of acres along a bend in the Mississippi River, where the water ran brown with mud and the air hung thick with humidity and human suffering. In 1848, the plantation was considered one of Louisiana's most productive sugar operations, but productivity here came at a price that few were willing to acknowledge, and even fewer were brave enough to document. Jacques Boudreaux ruled his domain with the calculated cruelty of a man who had learned to see human beings as nothing more than agricultural equipment. His ledgers, discovered in fragments among the courthouse documents, recorded births, deaths, and purchases with the same dispassionate precision he applied to livestock inventories. But it was between these lines, in the margins and coded annotations, that the true horror of the Boudreaux operation began to emerge. The plantation operated what Jacques euphemistically called his breeding program, a systematic approach to human reproduction that treated the enslaved population as livestock to be selectively bred for desired characteristics: strong backs for field work, quick minds for household management, and most disturbing of all, physical attributes that would fetch higher prices at the slave markets of New Orleans. Among the enslaved population were two brothers who would come to be known in whispered conversations and coded documents simply as J and M. These young men, likely in their early 20s by 1850, had arrived at Boudreaux as children following the death of their previous owner. They had grown up watching their community suffer under Jacques' increasingly brutal methods, witnessing friends and family members disappear into what the plantation's overseers called special assignments. The brothers possessed something that made them particularly valuable to Jacques Boudreaux: intelligence. They could read and write, skills they had acquired in secret despite laws forbidding such education. More dangerously, they could think strategically, plan carefully, and most importantly, they could inspire others to believe that their situation was not permanent. By 1849, whispers began circulating through the slave quarters about organized resistance. These were not the spontaneous uprisings that occasionally erupted across the South, quickly suppressed and forgotten. This was something more methodical, more patient, and infinitely more dangerous to the established order. The brothers had spent years studying the plantation's routines, mapping its vulnerabilities, and most crucially, identifying which of their fellow enslaved people could be trusted with their lives. They knew that any rebellion would need to be total. There could be no survivors among the plantation's white population to tell the tale, and there could be no half measures that would lead to the kind of brutal retaliation that had crushed previous uprisings across the South. But their plan went far beyond simple revenge. In hushed conversations held in the depths of Louisiana's swampland during rare moments of freedom, the brothers spoke of something that had never been attempted before: not just escape, but the creation of an entirely new kind of community, hidden in the vast wilderness of the Bayou country, where they could live as truly free people. The Louisiana Bayou in 1850 was a vast, unmapped wilderness that even the most experienced hunters avoided. It was a maze of waterways, cypress swamps, and hidden islands where a person could disappear forever, either by choice or by accident. The brothers had explored these waterways during hunting expeditions, learning to navigate channels that appeared on no official maps, discovering hidden clearings where a community could potentially sustain itself, far from the reach of plantation owners, slave catchers, and federal authorities. As 1850 approached, the atmosphere at Boudreaux Plantation grew increasingly tense. Jacques had begun implementing even more brutal control measures, apparently sensing that something was stirring among his human property. Punishments became more severe, surveillance more constant, and the psychological pressure more intense. He had no way of knowing that his very efforts to tighten control were providing his enslaved population with exactly the motivation they needed to risk everything on an unprecedented gamble. The brothers knew they would only get one chance. If they failed, not only would they face certain death, but their failure would likely result in collective punishment for the entire enslaved community. The stakes could not have been higher, and the margin for error could not have been smaller. The true horror of the Boudreaux operation lay not in its overt brutality, though that was certainly present, but in its systematic dehumanization disguised as rational business practice. Jacques Boudreaux had transformed the traditional plantation model into something far more sinister, a human breeding and conditioning facility that operated with the efficiency of a modern factory and the moral emptiness of a slaughterhouse. The plantation's records, fragmentary as they are, reveal a man obsessed with genetic manipulation decades before such concepts would gain scientific legitimacy. Jacques maintained detailed genealogical charts of his enslaved population, tracking bloodlines and physical characteristics across multiple generations. He had divided his human property into categories: field workers, house servants, artisans, and most disturbing of all, what he termed breeding stock. Women identified for the breeding program were subjected to forced partnerships designed to produce children with specific physical and mental characteristics. Jacques believed he could create a superior class of enslaved people who would be more valuable at market and more efficient in their labor. The psychological trauma inflicted by this system extended far beyond its immediate victims, creating a climate of fear and despair that permeated every aspect of plantation life. The brothers J and M had been selected for different roles in this system. The older brother, J, possessed the physical strength and intelligence that made him valuable as a skilled laborer and potential overseer of other enslaved people. The younger, M, had been identified for what Jacques called intellectual development, a program designed to create highly educated house servants who could manage complex household operations while remaining psychologically broken enough to never consider rebellion. This separation of the brothers was itself a form of psychological warfare. Jacques understood that family bonds represented the greatest threat to his system of control, and he made it his practice to either separate families entirely or to create situations where family members became complicit in each other's oppression. By forcing J to work as a field overseer and M to serve in the main house, he hoped to drive a wedge between them that would eliminate any possibility of coordinated resistance. But Jacques had underestimated the depth of the brothers' bond and their capacity for long-term strategic thinking. Rather than allowing their separation to destroy their relationship, they used their different positions to gather intelligence about the plantation's operations from multiple perspectives. J learned the routines and vulnerabilities of the field operations, the locations of weapons and tools, and the loyalties and capabilities of their fellow enslaved people. M, working in the main house, gained access to Jacques' correspondence, business records, and most importantly, his plans for the future of the plantation. Through M's position, the brothers learned that Jacques was planning to expand his breeding program significantly in 1850. He had arranged to purchase additional breeding stock from plantations across Louisiana and was constructing new quarters specifically designed to house what he projected would be a population of over 500 enslaved people within 5 years. More disturbing still, he had begun corresponding with other plantation owners about sharing breeding techniques and potentially creating a network of similar operations across the Deep South. The brothers realized that they were witnessing the early stages of what could become a systematic industrialization of human breeding, extending far beyond the boundaries of the Boudreaux plantation. This knowledge added urgency to their planning and expanded their sense of responsibility beyond their immediate community to enslaved people across the region. During the winter of 1849, the brothers began implementing the first phase of their plan: psychological preparation of their community. This required extraordinary delicacy, as any hint of organized resistance could lead to immediate and brutal retaliation. They began with small acts of sabotage designed to appear accidental: tools breaking at crucial moments, equipment being misplaced, small fires that caused delays but no serious damage. More importantly, they began identifying individuals within the enslaved community who possessed the mental strength and moral courage necessary for what they were planning. This was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their preparation, as a single betrayal would doom not only their rebellion, but likely result in the torture and execution of everyone involved. The selection process took months and required careful observation of how individuals reacted under pressure, how they treated their fellow enslaved people, and most crucially, how they spoke about freedom when they thought no one was listening. The brothers were looking for people who had not been broken by their circumstances, who retained both hope and anger, and who possessed the practical skills necessary for survival in the wilderness. By early 1850, they had identified approximately 30 individuals who they believed could be trusted with their lives. This group included skilled craftsmen, hunters, women experienced in midwifery and herbal medicine, and several individuals who had attempted escape in the past and possessed knowledge of the surrounding terrain. The final element of their preparation involved reconnaissance of the bayou country, where they planned to establish their hidden community. Using hunting expeditions and other legitimate reasons to leave the plantation, the brothers spent months exploring the waterways, identifying potential settlement sites, and most crucially, establishing supply caches that would allow their group to survive the initial months after their rebellion. March 15, 1850, began like any other day at the Boudreaux plantation, but it would end with acts of violence that would echo through Louisiana's hidden history for more than a century and a half. The brothers had chosen this date carefully. It was the night of the new moon, providing maximum darkness for their operation, and it coincided with a business trip that would take several of the plantation's overseers to New Orleans, leaving the main house more vulnerable than usual. The plan they had developed over months of careful preparation was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Unlike previous slave rebellions that had erupted spontaneously and been quickly suppressed, this was a calculated military operation designed to eliminate all witnesses and create the conditions for a permanent escape that could never be traced or reversed. The signal came at midnight when M used his access to the main house to extinguish the oil lamps that served as security lighting around the plantation's central buildings. In the darkness that followed, 31 enslaved people moved with the precision of a trained military unit toward predetermined targets across the plantation. The brothers had divided their force into 3 groups, each with specific objectives. The first group, led by J, was responsible for securing the plantation's weapons, hunting rifles, tools that could serve as weapons, and most crucially, the keys to the chains and shackles that bound many of their fellow enslaved people. The second group was tasked with controlling the plantation's communication systems, cutting telegraph lines, disabling signal bells, and preventing any warning from reaching neighboring plantations. The third group, led by M, had the most dangerous assignment, neutralizing the plantation's white population. This group moved through the main house and overseer quarters with deadly efficiency, ensuring that no one would survive to organize pursuit or alert authorities to what had transpired. The violence that followed was swift and total. Jacques Boudreaux and his family were eliminated in their sleep, along with the plantation's overseers and several visitors who had the misfortune to be present that night. The brothers had made the calculation that half measures would lead to their own destruction and the brutal retaliation against any enslaved people who remained behind. But the rebellion was only the first phase of their plan. Within hours of securing the plantation, the group began implementing an evacuation strategy that they had rehearsed in secret for months. They loaded supplies, tools, and weapons onto boats and began a carefully planned journey into the bayou country, following routes that J and M had scouted extensively during their preparations. The logistics of moving 31 people through the dangerous waterways of Louisiana's swampland required extraordinary coordination and knowledge of the terrain. The group traveled only at night, following channels that appeared on no official maps, and stopping during daylight hours on hidden islands where they could rest without being detected from shore. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from, and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The brothers had prepared for this journey by establishing supply caches at strategic points along their route, hidden in locations that only they knew how to find. These caches contained food, fresh water, medical supplies, and tools necessary for establishing their permanent settlement. The journey took nearly 2 weeks, during which the group faced not only the physical dangers of the swampland, but the psychological pressure of knowing that their former lives had been completely and irrevocably destroyed. On March 28, 1850, the group reached their destination, a collection of interconnected islands deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, hidden among cypress trees and accessible only by waterways that required expert knowledge to navigate. This location had been chosen because it was far from any established settlements, surrounded by natural barriers that made accidental discovery unlikely, and rich in the natural resources necessary to sustain a permanent community. The site they selected would become known among its inhabitants as New Eden, a hidden settlement that would grow over the following decades into a thriving community of free people living completely outside the legal and social structures of the antebellum South. But establishing this community would require more than just finding a hidden location. It would demand the creation of entirely new social, economic, and political systems designed to support people who had lived their entire lives under the dehumanizing conditions of slavery. The first months at New Eden were a test of survival that pushed the group to the limits of their endurance. They had to clear land for agriculture, construct shelters capable of withstanding Louisiana's brutal weather, establish systems for fresh water and sanitation, and create defenses against both natural predators and the possibility of discovery by slave catchers or military authorities. The transformation of 31 desperate fugitives into the founding population of a hidden society represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the secret history of American resistance. The brothers J and M had not simply led an escape. They had undertaken the unprecedented task of creating a completely autonomous community that could sustain itself indefinitely while remaining invisible to the outside world. The early months at New Eden tested every aspect of their planning and preparation. The location they had chosen offered natural protection and abundant resources, but converting these advantages into a functioning society required skills, knowledge, and cooperation that had been systematically denied to enslaved people throughout the South. They had to become farmers, builders, hunters, healers, teachers, and leaders simultaneously, all while maintaining absolute secrecy about their existence. The community's survival depended on achieving complete self-sufficiency within the first year. They could not risk trading with outside communities or seeking help from sympathetic individuals, as any contact with the outside world might lead to discovery and destruction. This meant developing every capability necessary for sustaining life entirely from within their own resources and knowledge. Agriculture became their first priority, but farming in the bayou required techniques completely different from the plantation agriculture they had known. The group included several individuals with experience in growing rice and other crops suited to wetland environments, but they had to experiment with new methods and learn through trial and error how to maximize food production in their unique environment. The brothers organized the community's labor through a democratic council system that represented a radical departure from the hierarchical structures they had known. Every adult had a voice in community decisions, and leadership roles were assigned based on expertise and consensus rather than imposed authority. This system worked because it was based on mutual survival needs rather than abstract political principles. Housing construction required innovation and adaptation to local conditions. Traditional building techniques were inadequate for structures that needed to withstand flooding, hurricanes, and the humidity of the swampland while remaining concealed from aerial observation. The community developed elevated building techniques using local cypress wood and natural materials that blended invisibly into the surrounding landscape. One of the most crucial challenges involved establishing systems for education and cultural preservation. The community included individuals with literacy skills, but they needed to create schools for children and provide continuing education for adults who had been denied learning opportunities under slavery. More importantly, they needed to develop ways of preserving their history and cultural identity while adapting to their new circumstances. The brothers understood that their community's long-term survival would depend not just on physical sustainability, but on maintaining the psychological and spiritual strength necessary to thrive in isolation. They established systems for conflict resolution, community celebrations, and spiritual practices that drew on African traditions, Christian beliefs, and new customs developed specifically for their unique situation. Security remained a constant concern throughout the community's early years. They established watch systems and early warning networks that could detect approaching strangers long before they could threaten the settlement. They also developed evacuation procedures that would allow the entire community to disappear into the swampland within minutes, if discovery seemed imminent. The community's medical needs were addressed through a combination of traditional herbal knowledge and new techniques developed through experimentation. They had no access to formal medical care, so they had to become experts in treating injuries, illnesses, and childbirth using only resources available in their environment. Several members of the community had experience as midwives and healers, and they trained others to ensure that medical knowledge was widely distributed. By the end of 1850, New Eden had achieved a level of stability that surprised even its founders. They had successfully produced enough food to sustain the community through the winter, completed construction of permanent housing for all residents, and established systems for education, governance, and security that were functioning effectively. But perhaps most remarkably, they had begun to attract other fugitives from slavery who had learned of their existence through the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. The community's population began to grow as individuals and families made their way through the dangerous journey to join what was becoming known in whispered conversations as the place where freedom lives. The growth of New Eden created new challenges and opportunities. Each new arrival brought additional skills, knowledge, and perspectives that strengthened the community, but also increased the risks associated with maintaining secrecy and security. The brothers had to develop systems for vetting new arrivals and integrating them into the community without compromising the safety of existing residents. By 1852, New Eden had evolved from a survival community into a sophisticated economic system that operated completely outside the legal structures of the antebellum South. The community had achieved something that slavery's defenders claimed was impossible. A group of formerly enslaved people had created a prosperous, self-governing society that demonstrated their full humanity and capability for independent life. The community's economic development was based on careful exploitation of natural resources, combined with manufacturing and trade systems that remained invisible to outside authorities. The bayou environment provided abundant opportunities for hunting, fishing, and gathering, but the community's leaders understood that sustainable prosperity required more sophisticated economic activities. They established manufacturing operations that produced goods for trade with other hidden communities and sympathetic individuals along the Underground Railroad network. These operations included blacksmithing, woodworking, textile production, and food processing, all conducted using techniques that minimized the risk of detection while maximizing the quality and value of their products. The community's trading relationships extended across a network of secret connections that reached from Louisiana to Ohio and beyond. They traded manufactured goods, preserved foods, and medicinal preparations for tools, weapons, books, and other resources that could not be produced locally. These trading relationships were maintained through coded communications and trusted intermediaries who could move between the hidden community and the outside world without arousing suspicion. One of New Eden's most valuable economic assets was its knowledge of medicinal plants and healing techniques. The community included several individuals with extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, and they had access to plant species in the bayou that were not available in other regions. They developed preparations and treatments that were highly valued by both enslaved communities and free people of color throughout the South. The community also developed expertise in what might be called liberation services, helping other enslaved people escape to freedom and providing support for Underground Railroad operations. This work was extremely dangerous, but also provided the community with additional sources of income, new residents, and valuable intelligence about conditions across the region. Financial management in New Eden operated on principles completely different from the monetary systems of the outside world. The community used a combination of barter, mutual aid, and collective ownership that ensured everyone's basic needs were met while providing incentives for individual achievement and community contribution. The brothers had established what they called contribution councils that evaluated each person's work and allocated resources based on both individual needs and community benefit. This system avoided the hierarchical wage structures of the outside world, while ensuring that essential work was completed and individual talents were recognized and developed. Education had become one of the community's highest priorities, both for practical and philosophical reasons. They understood that knowledge was the foundation of both individual freedom and collective prosperity. The community operated schools for children and continuing education programs for adults, with curricula that included literacy, mathematics, practical skills, and what they termed freedom studies, analysis of political and social systems that helped residents understand their place in the broader world. The community's educational programs were remarkable for their breadth and sophistication. They included technical training in various crafts and trades, advanced literacy and mathematics, natural sciences focused on understanding their environment, and social studies that analyzed the political and economic systems that had oppressed them and the alternatives that might be possible. By 1855, New Eden's population had grown to over 200 residents, including children who had been born into freedom and knew no other life than that of the hidden community. These children represented both the community's greatest achievement and its most profound challenge, as they embodied the possibility of true freedom while also forcing their parents to confront questions about their long-term future. The community had achieved remarkable prosperity by the standards of the time. They had surplus production in agriculture and manufacturing, comfortable housing for all residents, comprehensive educational systems, and effective governance structures. They had proven that formerly enslaved people could create and maintain a complex, prosperous society when given the opportunity to do so. But their success also created new vulnerabilities. The larger the community became, the more difficult it was to maintain secrecy. The more prosperous they became, the more attractive they appeared to outsiders who might seek to exploit or destroy them. The more successful their educational systems became, the more their young people questioned whether hiding in the swampland was the best use of their capabilities and potential. The second generation of New Eden presented unprecedented challenges and opportunities for a community that had been founded on secrecy and separation from the outside world. Children born into freedom in the hidden settlement had never experienced slavery, knew nothing of the brutal realities that had driven their parents to rebellion, and increasingly questioned whether permanent isolation was the best path for their lives. By 1860, nearly 40 children had been born in New Eden, ranging from infants to young adults who had come of age knowing only life in the hidden community. These children were educated, skilled, confident, and curious about the world beyond the bayou. They represented the fulfillment of their parents' dreams of freedom, but also posed fundamental questions about the community's future direction and identity. The educational system that had been established in New Eden's early years had produced a generation of young people whose capabilities and knowledge far exceeded what would have been possible for them in the outside world. They were literate, numerate, skilled in various trades and crafts, and trained in the critical thinking and problem-solving abilities that their parents had been systematically denied under slavery. But education had also awakened ambitions and interests that could not be fully satisfied within the constraints of the hidden community. Young people who had studied literature wanted to write and publish their own works. Those who had learned about science and medicine wanted to pursue advanced study and practice their skills in broader contexts. Others who had developed artistic talents wanted to share their creativity with larger audiences. The brothers J and M, now recognized as the community's founding leaders, faced the most difficult decisions of their lives as they tried to balance the safety and security that had allowed their community to thrive against the legitimate aspirations of young people who had grown up in freedom and wanted to exercise that freedom more fully. Some members of the community argued for maintaining strict isolation, believing that any contact with the outside world would eventually lead to discovery and destruction. Others advocated for gradually increasing engagement with sympathetic communities and individuals, believing that their success and capabilities obligated them to help other enslaved people achieve freedom. The question became even more complex as national political tensions surrounding slavery intensified in the late 1850s. News of events like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, and John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry reached the community through their trading networks and underground connections. Community members debated whether these developments represented opportunities for broader liberation or increased dangers that required even greater caution and secrecy. If this story has already captured your attention, leave a like. This helps the story of the New Eden community reach more people. The community's young adults were particularly affected by reports of increasing resistance to slavery across the South. They had been raised on stories of their parents' courage and sacrifice, and many felt called to contribute to the broader struggle for freedom, rather than remaining hidden in the bayou. Some argued that their community's success proved that formerly enslaved people could govern themselves effectively, and that this proof should be shared with the world. The brothers implemented what they called exploration programs that allowed young adults to spend limited periods outside the community under carefully controlled circumstances. These programs were designed to satisfy curiosity about the outside world while maintaining security and providing practical experience that would benefit the community. Some young people served as couriers and agents for underground railroad operations, using their education and skills to help coordinate escape routes and provide support for freedom seekers. Others worked with sympathetic individuals in nearby communities, gathering intelligence about political developments and maintaining the trading relationships that supported the community's economy. These programs revealed both the remarkable capabilities of the community's young people and the profound challenges they faced in navigating a world that still denied the humanity and rights of people of African descent. Young adults who had grown up in an environment of equality and mutual respect encountered racism, violence, and legal restrictions that were shocking in their intensity and pervasiveness. The experiences of community members in the outside world also provided valuable intelligence about the changing political landscape. By 1860, it was becoming clear that the national conflict over slavery was approaching a crisis that would likely result in war. Community leaders had to consider how such a conflict might affect their isolation and security, and whether it might provide opportunities for transitioning from hidden resistance to open participation in the struggle for freedom. The community established what they called preparation councils that developed contingency plans for various scenarios that might emerge from national political developments. These plans included options for maintaining their hidden status, for gradually revealing their existence to sympathetic authorities, and for potential military participation if war actually occurred. The complexity of these decisions reflected how far the community had evolved from its origins as a group of desperate fugitives. They now had to consider not just their own survival, but their responsibilities to the broader struggle for freedom, their obligations to future generations, and their potential contributions to reshaping American society. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 transformed the strategic situation facing New Eden in ways that its founders could never have anticipated. The conflict that had seemed like a distant political crisis suddenly became an immediate reality that forced the community to abandon many of the principles of secrecy and isolation that had guided their survival for more than a decade. The war's impact on Louisiana was particularly intense, as the state became a crucial battleground for control of the Mississippi River and access to the Gulf of Mexico. Union and Confederate forces moved through the Bayou country with increasing frequency, conducting military operations that brought armed soldiers closer to New Eden than any outsiders had come since the community's founding. The community's leadership faced an impossible dilemma. Maintaining their traditional isolation was becoming increasingly difficult as military operations disrupted the transportation networks and trading relationships that supported their economy. But revealing their existence to either Union or Confederate authorities carried enormous risks, as they had no legal protection and no guarantee that their freedom would be recognized or respected by either side. The brothers J and M convened emergency councils throughout 1861 and 1862 to debate their options and develop strategies for survival in the dramatically changed environment. These discussions revealed fundamental disagreements within the community about their identity, obligations, and future direction. Older community members, particularly those who had experienced slavery directly, generally favored maintaining secrecy and avoiding involvement in the broader conflict. They argued that both Union and Confederate authorities represented threats to their freedom, and that their best chance for survival lay in remaining hidden until the war ended and political conditions stabilized. Younger community members, especially those who had grown up in freedom, were more inclined to support the Union cause and to see the war as an opportunity to help achieve the broader abolition of slavery. They argued that their community's success proved the capabilities of formerly enslaved people, and that they had moral obligations to help others achieve the freedom they had won for themselves. The debate was complicated by intelligence gathered through their trading networks about Union policies regarding enslaved people and contraband camps. Reports suggested that Union authorities were often confused and inconsistent in their treatment of fugitive slaves, sometimes providing protection and support, but other times returning people to slavery or failing to provide adequate assistance. The community ultimately decided to pursue a carefully calibrated strategy of limited engagement that would allow them to contribute to the Union cause while maintaining their security and independence. They began providing intelligence about Confederate movements in the Bayou region to Union forces while maintaining their hidden status and avoiding direct military involvement. This intelligence proved extremely valuable to Union military operations, as the community's knowledge of the waterways and terrain was far superior to anything available to outside military forces. Community members served as unofficial scouts and guides, helping Union forces navigate the complex Bayou environment while avoiding detection by Confederate patrols. The community also became involved in supporting contraband camps and assisting other escaped enslaved people who were seeking freedom behind Union lines. Their experience in surviving independently in the wilderness made them valuable advisors and teachers for people who were attempting to transition from slavery to freedom. These activities brought New Eden into contact with Union military officers, government officials, and abolitionists who were astonished to discover a thriving community of formerly enslaved people who had been governing themselves successfully for more than a decade. The community's existence challenged many assumptions about the capabilities and potential of African Americans that were widespread even among Union supporters. Some Union officials wanted to publicize New Eden's existence as proof that formerly enslaved people could function as independent citizens, but community leaders insisted on maintaining their privacy and security. They were willing to cooperate with Union forces but not to sacrifice the autonomy and self-determination they had fought so hard to achieve. The war years also brought new residents to New Eden, as word of the community's existence spread among enslaved people seeking freedom. The community's population grew to over 300 people by 1863, including many families with children who needed immediate assistance and long-term integration into the community's social and economic systems. This growth strained the community's resources and required expansion of their agricultural, housing, and educational systems. But it also brought new skills, knowledge, and perspectives that strengthened the community's capabilities and reinforced their sense of mission as a beacon of freedom in a world still dominated by slavery. The most significant challenge came in 1863 when Confederate forces conducted a major sweep through the Bayou region, searching for Union sympathizers and disrupting guerrilla activities. The community was forced to implement their emergency evacuation procedures, temporarily abandoning their settlement and hiding in the deepest parts of the swampland until the danger passed. This experience demonstrated both the vulnerability and resilience of the community. They were able to evacuate successfully without loss of life or capture, but the disruption to their normal activities and the stress of living in temporary shelters for several weeks reminded everyone of the precarious nature of their situation. The end of the Civil War in 1865 marked a watershed moment for New Eden, as the legal abolition of slavery theoretically eliminated the community's status as fugitives while raising fundamental questions about their future identity and relationship with the broader world. For the first time since their founding rebellion in 1850, the community faced the possibility of emerging from secrecy and participating openly in American society. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment had transformed the legal landscape, but the practical realities of Reconstruction presented both opportunities and dangers that the community's leaders struggled to navigate. Reports from across the South indicated that formerly enslaved people were facing violence, economic exploitation, and legal restrictions that often made their nominal freedom meaningless in practice. The brothers J and M, now recognized as elder statesmen within the community, led extensive discussions about whether to reveal their existence to Reconstruction authorities and seek official recognition as a legitimate settlement. These debates reflected the complex evolution of a community that had grown from a group of desperate fugitives into a sophisticated society with established institutions and traditions. Union military authorities who had worked with the community during the war encouraged them to seek official recognition and legal protection. They argued that New Eden represented a model of successful self-governance that could inspire other formerly enslaved communities and contribute to the broader project of Reconstruction. But community members were deeply skeptical of promises of legal protection, having observed the violence and betrayal that characterized Reconstruction politics across the South. They had survived and prospered through self-reliance and mutual aid, and many questioned whether integration into the broader political system would strengthen or weaken their community. The community ultimately decided to pursue a gradual approach to recognition that would allow them to maintain their autonomy while gradually increasing their engagement with outside institutions. They began by establishing formal legal ownership of their land through purchases and homestead claims that legitimized their occupation of the territory they had developed. This process required navigating complex legal and bureaucratic systems that were often hostile to African American landowners. Community members had to prove their financial resources, demonstrate their improvements to the land, and overcome legal challenges from individuals who claimed prior ownership rights to property that had been considered worthless swampland for decades. The legal recognition of New Eden as a legitimate settlement attracted attention from journalists, politicians, and scholars who were fascinated by the community's history and achievements. Visitors began arriving to study the community's governance systems, economic practices, and educational programs, many of them astonished to discover the sophistication and success of a society that had developed in complete isolation from mainstream institutions. These visits brought welcome recognition and validation, but also unwanted attention from individuals and groups who saw the community as a threat to established racial hierarchies. The community faced harassment, legal challenges, and occasional violence from white supremacist groups who were opposed to any demonstration of African American capability and independence. The community's response to these challenges demonstrated the maturity and wisdom they had developed through decades of self-governance. Rather than retreating into isolation or responding with violence, they used legal strategies, political organizing, and public education to defend their rights and expand their influence. They established relationships with sympathetic politicians, journalists, and activists who helped publicize their achievements and defend them against attacks. They also began sharing their expertise in education, agriculture, and community organization with other African American communities that were struggling to establish themselves in the post-slavery environment. By 1870, New Eden had become one of the most successful African American settlements in the South, with a population of over 400 residents, thriving agricultural and manufacturing operations, comprehensive educational systems, and effective governance structures. The community served as a training center for teachers, agricultural specialists, and community organizers who carried their methods and principles to other locations across the region. The community's schools began accepting students from outside the settlement, providing advanced education opportunities that were rarely available to African American children in the post-Reconstruction South. Their educational programs emphasized practical skills, critical thinking, and leadership development, producing graduates who went on to establish schools, businesses, and political organizations throughout Louisiana and beyond. The economic success of New Eden also provided a foundation for broader political engagement. Community members began participating in elections, running for local offices, and organizing voter registration drives that helped increase African American political participation across the region. But perhaps their most significant contribution was demonstrating that formerly enslaved people could create and maintain complex, prosperous communities when given the opportunity to do so. Their success challenged racial stereotypes and provided inspiration for other African American communities that were fighting for recognition and equality in the hostile environment of the post-Reconstruction South. The story of New Eden entered a new chapter in the 1880s as Reconstruction ended and the Jim Crow era began, forcing the community to adapt once again to changing political circumstances, while preserving the principles and achievements that had sustained them for more than 3 decades. The community that had begun as a desperate rebellion against slavery had evolved into a beacon of hope and possibility that would influence the struggle for civil rights well into the 20th century. The end of Reconstruction brought new challenges as federal protection for African American rights was withdrawn, and white supremacist governments regained control across the South. New Eden faced increasing legal restrictions, economic pressure, and organized violence designed to force African American communities back into positions of subordination and dependence. The community's response to these challenges drew on the same principles of strategic thinking, collective action, and adaptive innovation that had enabled their original survival. Rather than accepting defeat or abandoning their achievements, they developed new strategies for protecting their community and supporting the broader struggle for equality and justice. They established what they called preservation networks that documented their history, recorded their governance methods, and trained new generations of leaders who could carry forward their principles and practices. These networks operated as underground educational and political organizations that maintained connections with other African American communities and civil rights organizations across the South. The community's schools became even more important during the Jim Crow era, as they provided educational opportunities that were superior to what was available to African American children in the broader society. Students who graduated from New Eden schools went on to become teachers, lawyers, doctors, and political leaders who carried the community's values and methods into the mainstream civil rights movement. The brothers J and M, now elderly men revered as the community's founding fathers, worked to ensure that their story and achievements would be preserved for future generations. They collaborated with sympathetic historians and journalists to create written records of the community's development, though much of this documentation remained hidden to protect the community from retaliation. The community's economic strategies also adapted to the changing environment, as they developed new forms of cooperative enterprise and mutual aid that helped them maintain their prosperity while supporting other African American communities that were struggling under Jim Crow restrictions. They established credit unions, agricultural cooperatives, and mutual insurance societies that provided alternatives to the discriminatory financial systems of the broader society. By the early 1900s, New Eden had become a symbol of African American achievement and self-determination that inspired civil rights activists across the country. Leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois visited the community and wrote about its achievements, though they disagreed about whether its model of separate development was the best strategy for advancing African American rights. The community's influence extended far beyond Louisiana, as former residents established similar communities in other states and carried New Eden's principles into various civil rights organizations. The NAACP, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and other civil rights groups included leaders who had been trained in New Eden's schools or had learned from community members who shared their methods and experiences. The story of New Eden remained largely hidden from mainstream American history until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought new attention to the historical struggles and achievements of African Americans. Historians and journalists began researching communities like New Eden and documenting their contributions to the long struggle for freedom and equality. The community itself continued to thrive through the 20th century, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core principles of self-determination, mutual aid, and collective responsibility. The descendants of the original rebels continued to live in the Bayou settlement, though many also pursued careers and opportunities in the broader society that their ancestors had been forced to abandon. Modern archaeological and historical research has confirmed many aspects of the New Eden story, while revealing additional details about the community's achievements and influence. Documents discovered in archives across the country have provided new insights into the community's operations and their connections with other resistance movements and civil rights organizations. The community's legacy extends far beyond its historical significance to encompass ongoing contributions to discussions about community development, sustainable agriculture, alternative education, and cooperative economics. Their methods and principles continue to influence contemporary efforts to build more equitable and sustainable communities. Today, New Eden serves as both a historical landmark and a living community that continues to evolve while honoring its extraordinary origins. The settlement that began with two brothers' desperate rebellion against slavery has become a testament to the power of courage, vision, and collective action to transform impossible circumstances into lasting achievements. Subscribe to the channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the New Eden community. See you in the next video.